How'd you like to listen to .NET Rocks with no ads? Easy. Become a patron. For just $5 a month, you get access to a private RSS feed where all the shows have no ads. $20 a month will get you that and a special .NET Rocks patron mug. Sign up now at patreon.netrocks.com. Hey, guess what? It's .NET Rocks. It's 2024. I'm Carl Franklin. That's Richard Campbell.
Hey, I am so.
All day.
Yeah, every time.
How you doing, buddy?
I follow me everywhere. Sometimes I forget my name and I check it, and sometimes I think I'm Joe Boxer, but I'm not.
Who's Joe Boxer? Is that a Canadian thing?
It's the name on my underwear.
Oh, all right. It's like, what is that, Canadian Fruit of the Loom?
Yeah, I don't think I would be named Fruit, but Joe works.
I'm the grapes.
There you go.
Just fermented nicely. So how was your, New Year's and Christmas and all that?
Well, everything's changed now. We sold the big house in the city,
Mm-hmm.
I'm still working on the whole how do you sell a smart home thing. But, now we don't have the big house in the center of the family anymore.
Right.
So things move around. So the younger daughter hosted the Christmas meal, which was fun.
Oh, that's cool. That's got to be great for her, huh?
Yeah. It just brings back the memory for me when we got that house in 2000. My father looking through it for that first Christmas going, okay, you're it.
That's right. Yeah.
I'm not doing it anymore. And I never felt that way per se, but suddenly we're in this position.
Yeah.
But the other thing is there is a guest house up here. So the older daughter and her business partner, they're working from here for the next 2 weeks. So they came up right after New Year's and so we have dinner most nights and that kind of thing. So it's like we're living in a little village right now.
Yeah. We're going to have a quiz on Richard's life, personal life after the show.
Yeah.
So get out your pen.
If you're all paying attention.
And pencil.
But
That's very, very cool.
Just be aware when I'm recording here, I'm looking out at the ocean as well. Like that's the lifestyle.
I'm in the coolest studio I've ever owned. So
yeah, no, it looks great.
And Jimmy Bogard is here. We're going to talk to him in just a few minutes. But first, better know a framework.
Awesome.
All
right, man, what do you got?
All right, so it's been a while since I explained better know a framework. It started out as just a piece in the beginning of the show where I find a little piece of the .NET framework, maybe a namespace or a class or something you didn't know was there, and talk about it. And that quickly got old. And then it became...
I was several years of talking about the framework.
Well, yeah.
But the problem when you do a show for 20 years is eventually you get through the framework.
You get through the framework, right, and you run out of things. And then, it becomes more interesting to find things that are going on in the world and just spotlight them. So that's what it is. And today's spotlight is... speaking of .NET 8 migrations, this is a class that I'm going to be teaching online in January 27th, called Essential Blazor in .NET 8. So it's a one-day hands-on remote class with Zoom, and I've got a link to it there on the website, and also because this is episode 1880. If you go to 1880.pwop.me or blazor.appvnext.com, you'll get to it.
Awesome.
It's an Eventbrite page, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. See, this is the cool thing, is that this is what I do. I say, hey, I'm teaching this class, and that forces me to go through all my materials and update it. And
oh no, you announced the class before you finish writing it. Goodness knows.
Well, I have the content, but it needs to be updated. It needs to be migrated and then, re-explained, within the context of .NET 8.
I got asked for new geek outs for 2024. So I sat down and wrote 2 great abstracts. I can't wait to see what the talks are like.
Yeah. It's kind of a reality in our world.
It is. That's it.
Yeah.
It's like, you know what I really like? How about this? And I send out this abstract. They're like, yeah, do that. I'm like, no, damn, now I have to write it.
But now it's the fun part. You've given yourself a deadline and you can do it. It's not that you can't. So
I mean, and let's be clear, it's how to become a spacefaring civilization and understanding nuclear power. Two things I can probably cuff for an hour, but I think I'll actually, finish the research and write more stuff.
And okay, so that's what I got. Who's talking to us today, Richard?
Grabbed a comment off of show 1862, the one we did back in September with one Jimmy Bogard. Maybe you've heard of him.
Never heard of him.
When we were talking about his open source project, or one of the ones that he's involved with, Mediator. Yep. And Jimmy Scott said, and this is right after the show published, he sent this message. He said, "We use Mediator for persistence of our settings in a solution, and it's a dream when it compared to the service locator pattern, which sucked. I understand some drawbacks of Mediator, lots of tiny classes, indirection, but the key advantages far outweigh those. The centralization of data persistence logic, which can be invoked from other than web APIs, easily testable logic, and Mediator's delegating handler pattern, easily decorate requests with common handling logic."
Yeah.
I don't know, Jimmy. I think you got a fan there.
I guess so.
He's making good
One
things.
of the many.
Yeah, without a doubt. Jimmy, we'll pass that along to Jimmy. Look, 2 Jimmys. And thanks so much for your comment. And a copy of Music to Go By is on its way to you. And if you'd like a copy of Music to Go By, write a comment on the website at .netrocks.com or on the Facebooks. We publish every show there. And if you comment there and I read it on the show, we'll send you a copy of Music to Go By.
And you can follow us on Twitter if you want to, but the cool kids are hanging out on Mastodon these days. I'm at Carl Franklin at techhub.social.
And I'm Rich Campbell at mastodon.social.
Send us a tweet, an X, a poot, whatever the heck you call them. Just get it to us.
Any of those things. I got an account on Threads now and Blue Sky, and they're all kind of fun.
They are kind of fun.
Yeah, they each, I like the smaller communities. It reminds you of why we liked social media in the first place.
That's what I love about being on Mastodon.
Yeah.
Is that there's no advertising. There's no crap. It's just good stuff. All right. Let's bring Jimmy Bogard on. Of course, he's been on many times before. He's the creator and maintainer of the popular OSS libraries AutoMapper and Mediator. Jimmy's an independent software consultant based in Austin, Texas, and he has received the MVP award every year since 2009. Welcome back, Jimmy.
Good to see you again.
Yeah, I need to punch your frequent flyer card there. I think it's number 6, including an open source panel. So, yeah.
Oh, jeez. Yeah.
I think you are more than the number of episodes you've done. It's just the number of times you're referred to as the kind of the right way to do open source. Like when a nice person does the right thing by a project that sort of gets out of control. I think of Jimmy Bogard and just like the madness that you ended up with AutoMapper.
Oh, you didn't have to like bleep out something after they mentioned my name?
I also think, Jimmy, that you're a real generalist, and your knowledge and experience is vast horizontally as well as vertically. I remember being in Oslo, maybe somewhere with you overseas, and it was before the conference started. And we were just sitting down, maybe at breakfast or something, and just riffed on messaging, enterprise messaging.
Oh, yeah.
And do you remember that conversation?
No.
Fair. We have a lot of conversations.
Okay. But, you can remember having conversations like that, I'm sure.
Yeah.
Because it was just great. It's really cool to have conversations with somebody who has this knowledge that he doesn't get to share with most people. But, these two people meet that, oh, yeah, enterprise messaging. Let's talk about that for an hour. It's great.
Okay. No, I am remembering this conversation now because, again, it doesn't seem like people do that very much in maybe the .NET space. I'm not sure. But it's one of those things like once you get introduced to, you're like, oh, there's this whole like universe of this technology that is really cool, but just not a lot of people get to touch it very much.
Yep. True that.
It is also a space where it's a way of thinking when you're building software at a certain scale or a certain level of complexity. And if you're in that space, like it's really awesome. And if you're not, it's just people are looking at you like, why would you do that? That seems unnecessary. Like, well, look.
Come on, guys. Let's talk about fishing or Seinfeld or something normal.
Oh no, you guys love talking about messaging, and I don't mind talking about messaging either. But the one that I have to stop myself on, Home Assistant. Like, if you're into Home Assistant, we could talk for days. If you are not, don't do it. Just stop. Like, not a thing.
Yeah.
Anyway, we were going to talk about work because you've been up to stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, this topic is like that was my life for about 12 to 18 months. doing this modernization migration effort.
So before the shipping of .NET, you were moving an app to 8 or just to the modern version of .NET?
So this was actually to .NET 6, and then eventually did migrate to .NET 8. But the big jump was to .NET 6 initially from .NET 4.8.
Right. So what's the big hurdle? Getting rid of ASP.NET Web Forms?
Oh God. Okay. So yeah, that was. I mean, the first big thing we had to worry about was just what exists in their current system, and then what is the migration path to something over on .NET 6? And Web Forms is one of those things. Like there is no straightforward path. It is just a straight up rewrite. So there may be like conversion tools to Blazor or something like that, but the Web Forms as a model does not exist in .NET Core or whatever you want to call it. .NET 6, 7, 8 just doesn't exist.
So do you just rewrite those pages in your favorite flavor? Go Razor pages or Blazor or whatever makes you happy?
Pretty much. We've got some folks want to go like, modernize the page to begin with. So, let's rewrite those set of pages to be like, SPA Angular sort of style, because maybe that component style architecture makes a lot of sense for those pages. Right. And maybe it doesn't. So really like a page by page, whatever. This system though luckily only had one Web Forms page. So it was just like a only one of those.
Yeah.
Otherwise it would have been a big, rewrite. But we had to look through everything, like what all the screens, what all the technology the screens are built on. And then also all the behind the scenes junk, like the middleware, any kind of back-end whatever junk that was going on as well.
Now, did you have any maintainers of the 4.8 version? Like, was it compilable? It was in a maintained state at least?
Oh yeah. So this was like a live app that was still having ongoing feature development too. So we, as part of the migration process, we'd worry about, we can't ask the business to stop feature development for months at a time while we'll do this migration process. Like that conversation never goes well.
Yeah, it's not
right.
We stop doing things you care about for things that we need.
And no doubt when you're doing this migration, you uncover some technical debt that you may or may not have known was there, right? And invariably happens.
Oh, absolutely. So that was a big thing for us. It's just we're gonna turn over some rocks and see something we don't expect. And like, do we just turn the rock over again and be like, whoops, let's just tape that over, or do we try to or do we try to like fix it?
Why does this class exist, and why do we keep passing it around? What is that?
Yeah,
it's like Gordon Ramsay going into your walk-in. You're like, what is that?
Yeah, I mean, we have cases where, so one big thing we did at the beginning was just analyze dependencies. Like, what does this application depend on? And do those things exist and are supported in .NET Core? And for several of those things, they didn't. So we said, do we, there's kind of like shims and bridges that exist at .NET Core to like call APIs in .NET Framework and like cross your fingers, hope they exist. But that's just I didn't like that because you only know if it's going to work at runtime. And we didn't want to know if we failed or not to like, we tried to call this method. It doesn't actually exist. So we're just going to blow up and our users see that. So as much as possible, we said, well, let's go ahead and upgrade those things in place in the .NET Framework app. And then we got a straightforward migration path over to .NET Core for those things.
Did you use any like migration advisor tools, anything like that?
There are a couple of those out there. There's one that Microsoft had out there to analyze your dependencies and kind of tell you, but it spit out a list of items that was like a spreadsheet with 10,000 rows. And like, how do you sift through this?
If I'm going to take that much time, I'm going to do it myself.
Yeah, that's basically what we went through. It's like, well, we know what we're looking for here, so we'll just go through and find those things. So one good example is like EF6. This app used EF6. EF6 wasn't supported in .NET Core for a very long time. And then eventually Microsoft said, this is a big hurdle for people migrating. So we're going to like release another version whose sole purpose is to, cover the 99% of the features and support it in .NET Core so that it's easier to upgrade. So that was one like, okay, we go from 6.1 to 6.5. Okay, now we get an upgrade path and we're not going to replace it with EF Core because that is a big undertaking.
Right. So just that there is a friendly version of EF now in 6.5 that makes that problem go away so you don't have to tear everything apart.
Yeah. And so just we know we want to upgrade EF Core, but it lets us not have to do everything all at once. That's what we're trying to do, is make very small incremental changes that we can still release to production every time we make this change.
Well, and the implication here is like, don't do the bridging back to 4.8. That's bad. But do take advantage of the entity framework interim state, because that's good. That'll be all right.
It's a shorter migration path, because really we wanted to get on .NET Core. That was the big thing, .NET 6, 7, 8. And then once we were there, we could say, okay, let's go ahead and modernize these other pieces that have better things or better ways of doing things in the .NET 7, 8 space.
Right. And that, I mean, and I guess that begs that early question, which is, why are we doing this? What are we getting for it? There's nothing wrong with 4.8, right?
Performance.
No, so
memory
this
usage.
For this client though, their big thing was like they wanted to take advantage of things in ASP.NET Core as the framework.
Right.
And so this application being built on that and being built on ASP.NET 4.8, they saw that, well, that's really not getting updated or improved. And so if this application is going to live on in the future, then we want to be on top of a framework. So it's less about .NET 8 and more about ASP.NET Core, as this is a web application that needs to live for another 10 years and grow and improve and change.
Right. The question is, would it be better to wait longer? Like, you were obviously not jumping on the earliest versions of ASP.NET Core, which were rough, but you've got a mature version. It's like, when's the right time to jump? Because you do want those new features.
Yeah. So for this application in particular, and the most of them I see, .NET 6 and 7 was the right time for them.
Right.
And the reason why is that Microsoft introduced a few set of libraries and tools to make that migration incrementally 8,000 times easier. Before that, if you wanted to migrate incrementally, it was a very manual process to do so. And I can kind of walk through what we used to do. What we used to do for like .NET Core 3.1, for example, we didn't want to have a big bang migration. Never want to do that. That's just fraught with risk. The flipping the switch is just, how do you do regression testing of a whole system? That's just not.
And the only thing that sucks more than flipping that switch is flipping it back.
Well, we did do that. So we wanted to say there's no roll back. There's only roll forward. You fix things and incrementally go. So in the old days when we did this in .NET Core 3.1, way we would do this is we'd have two apps. One is your .NET Core app. One is a .NET Framework app.
Right.
And then we would manually migrate pages from .NET Framework over to .NET Core. But from the kind of end user perspective, they'd still be hitting .NET Framework, even if those pages the new pages exist in .NET Core. So we would introduce a reverse proxy in front of both of those apps, Nginx or something like that, where we'd say, oh, this sprint, we've migrated these pages. And so these pages should now go over to the new system, the .NET Core app, and the old pages go over there. So it was a very much a very manual process to be able to do all these sort of things. But starting with .NET 6, Microsoft introduced a set of tools to make that automatic switching between applications seamless and transparent and so much easier.
Yeah.
How do you share the state with those two things? That must be a bear.
Okay. Well, let me explain first the way that's automatic switching works. It's wild. So, have y'all had folks talk about YARP before? Yet another reverse proxy?
I think so. Yeah, I think maybe Mark Rendell talked about it a little bit, but I don't remember.
Yeah, that makes sense because he has a tool as well to make this migration easier. So YARP is yet another reverse proxy, and it's a reverse proxy that can be hosted in the ASP.NET Core pipeline. So it's kind of cool. You can actually self-host a reverse proxy, and that's exactly what this tooling does. It's the name is kind of strange, but it's System Web Adapters is the name of it. But the idea is that you have a new ASP.NET Core application, and that hosts a reverse proxy. And a request will come in initially to your .ASP.NET Core application. And if that application cannot handle that request successfully, like the controller doesn't exist, it will automatically forward that request over to your ASP.NET full framework application. Okay. So if I migrate a controller from 4.8 to ASP.NET Core, well, suddenly that application can handle that request and is going to serve it up. But if it can't, the controller's missing, just seamlessly forwards that request and serves the response out over to, so it still serves the response through the ASP.NET Core application, but it's just proxy. We're doing a reverse proxy to your full framework application.
So I guess what I'm getting at is there's no real shared state, except for, data persistence or whatever that exists between those two things. Is there, because they're completely different?
Well, okay. So there has to be some shared state. So things like authentication.
Yeah.
Both applications have to know that you're logged in.
Right.
So really depending on your authentication scheme, you have to decide how you're going to share that state. So if you're in an external SSO, then you just configure those applications to be able to read that token effectively. That's not a big deal.
Yeah, they both have rights to that token.
Mm-hmm.
We weren't doing SSO. We were doing cookie auth that was self-hosted.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So if you've ever had to do so effectively, well, how do you do SSO with cookies? Do you have both applications be able to read the data protection certificate and be able to read that cookie? So that is actually the way we went, was like, well, we have access to that data protection certificate. So what we'll do is they're both initially hosted on the same machine. Like they're just two IIS web applications, self-hosted. So they both had access to the certificates. Okay. So we said, okay, the .NET Framework application is going to continue to do the login and logout and set the cookie. And then the .NET Core application is then able to read that cookie and be able to set the principal roles, all that sort of junk. And so that just worked fine, that it could read that information.
And effectively, you're putting a flag in the ground that says, "Here's our cut across," is when we're going to change the .NET Framework app to give up authentication. But for now, it owns it.
Yeah, that was actually the last thing we changed. Was like the very last thing we migrated was login. Okay, now we have to worry about how do we share, all that sort of stuff. Next was session state. So that's another shared state that the .NET Core application has to read and write session, and the .NET Framework application has to read and write session. So how do you share those two? How do you share that sort of shared state? Now, unfortunately, the SQL schema of session is not the same on both sides. So it's not like you can say, well, I'm already doing a web farm scenario on .NET Framework that uses SQL as a backing storage. Those schemas are completely different. So they can't read and write the same sort of back-end database of session state.
Of course.
So what the system web adapters does is for any kind of sort of shared state that you have between those two, and session is just one example of that, is the system web adapters will expose an API endpoint in the .NET Framework application via middleware, like OWIN or whatever. And then when the .NET Core application needs to I need to read session state, instead of reading its own thing, it will make a API call to get that stuff from the .NET Framework application. And then you just have these interface adapters that you're talking to get that data out. But all that
makes sense. All
the API stuff, if there's an API token, API key thing to secure it, it's not exposed to the outside world, all that sort of junk. But now I'm just exposing APIs to be able to get that sort of data back out again.
What's kind of funny and ironic about this scenario is that all the things that Microsoft has done in ASP.NET to make it easier for development now becomes like a problem when you're trying to have two of these things exist at the same time, sharing state, right? I mean, like session state, the session bag, the application bag, all that stuff makes it easy for developers. It's like, boom, on one system. But now that simplicity that was, making it easy is now hard.
Yeah, exactly. But luckily, they recognize that, and they've offered up solutions to be able to do so. But not everything had a solution available for us. So a good example is shared code. How do you share code between these two applications? And so for .NET stuff, yeah, exactly. So we pull things up into a shared library that is now, .NET standard probably, so that both can be able to use it. And so for business logic, that's pretty straightforward to do. For UI logic, there's no sharing. Like we had a lot of copy paste, like any kind of razor helper things, like those APIs are just different. We had a lot of controller library, like base controller classes. Those are just different namespaces. We can't share those, so we just copy paste whatever.
Are these that much different for people actually using them? If the names are different, who cares? But like, is it hard to keep both in your head?
No. Luckily, like from the application developer perspective, it's really just changing namespaces. Like there's slight, there's action results versus action result. That's very little, but from like you could blink at it and be like, well, that's almost the same.
Yeah.
But there were like actual missing features in ASP.NET Core from ASP.NET 4.5. And a good example of that was bundling and minification. That is not a thing that exists in ASP.NET Core, but does exist in ASP.NET, and it will never exist in ASP.NET Core. Like they're not in the bundling and minification business. Like before, Microsoft was like, yes, there are like node ways of doing this, but we'll provide a way of doing it. Now today they're like, this is a solved problem, but solved by not us. So use that thing.
And like I said, this is a solved problem. Like, why would they build their own, right? You just go out and get the best one you can. Like, you don't need to make another one. It's just another thing to support. And
we looked at that. So anytime we hit these sort of things that there is no direct migration path, we have to decide what is that target end state that we want to get to. So bundling and minification was an example that, okay, yes, there are people that solve this problem, but they're all in the node world.
Yeah.
And so we had to ask ourselves, okay, do we want to introduce this other build and asset pipeline that is totally different than what we have today? Or is there something else can help bridge the gap? So we actually went with a tool called Web Optimizer, which is very similar to the ASP.NET 4.8 bundling and minification, but for ASP.NET Core.
Okay.
So if you have very simple bundling and minification needs, that can do the trick. So we saw that like, well, okay, maybe the right answer eventually is to use a true bundling and minification pipeline. But for now, let's just kind of go easy mode and do something that is solving the problem in a very similar way than what existed on ASP.NET 4.8.
Again, it seems like in a later version, we can optimize this further. But for now, there is minification and bundling in a pipeline. So close enough.
Exactly. And we saw that the node pipelines would force us to even structure all of our assets differently.
Wow.
So we thought, okay, like it won't be exactly the same. So we even did tricks like in Visual Studio, you can, right click files and say add as link. So the file actually exists in one place on disk. And so we did that a lot for these sort of static assets that we would automatically add all these folders as links so that the file existed in one place on disk, but had to be structured maybe slightly differently on either side.
Yeah, that's very cool.
Yeah, that's really interesting. But it also speaks to there are different philosophies of software development. And, don't be too wound up about it. Like, that's okay. If you're going to change philosophies, you have to learn a bunch of stuff.
It was all those sort of like micro architecture decisions of, okay, what is the shortest path to get us to production versus where do you want to go? And is the eventual end state on the way to getting us to production now? And if not, okay, then we have to make a decision. Do we take that chance now, or do we just, go sidestep it a little bit and say, let's just get something that can work for now, because our end goal is to have a whole app and production on .NET 8.
And Jimmy, I got to break for one moment for this very important message. And we're back. It's .NET Rocks. I'm Richard Campbell. That's Carl Franklin.
Hey.
Recording in 2024. Who would have thunk it?
Who'd have thunk?
And we're here with our friend Jimmy Bogard, talking a bit about his experiences migrating a .NET app, a framework app, a 4.8 app, up to .NET Core. I guess originally targeting 6, but heck, here's 8. Might as well go there.
Mm-hmm.
Was there any real differences between 6 and 8? Did you stop by 7 on the way? Was that a factor?
So one of my philosophies for just getting this deployed out is I wanted to get to production as early as possible. Mm-hmm. So for us, that meant our very first deployment was a completely blank .NET 6 app that did nothing but proxy straight over to the full .NET framework.
That totally makes sense.
It does in hindsight, but that is one of those like, okay, do we have something there that does anything or what? And because just getting that first .NET 6 app required us to do all the build and deploy pipelines and IS setup. We're like, we'll just do that. It'll be a foothold on the beachhead, and then we can start to build on top of that. So that's our first thing. Yeah.
Yeah, it's a hello world, right? Like you got to get there. You're one way or another going to do that. So the fact that you're only doing that first just, cuts away the other confusion of, well, why isn't that page working? Is it the page, or is it the proxy, or is it the authentication engine, or is it the session issue? Like there's a ton of things that could be wrong. Have as few things wrong as possible.
And the question of like which .NET version to target was also a challenging one, because there's a trade-off from looking at your dependencies, what is supported on both frameworks, because your business logic, if it depends on a library that is supported on both sides, it's good, but sometimes it's not supported to the latest and greatest framework. So sometimes you have to upgrade to an earlier version and then migrate upwards from there. So we actually had that with, we were looking at ASP.NET 7 that included a feature that we wanted to use, which was output caching. Output caching was only introduced with ASP.NET 7, and our system used that. So we're like, well, we want to use that, but then our dependencies didn't support all the way up to there. So like, okay, do we just like ignore some of the pages, or maybe don't have output caching for now and just wait on that until we're fully on, and then we introduce output caching? We actually found like someone at Microsoft backported through this NuGet package output caching with a label, do not use this. This is for, but we just felt like, well, we'll just go in. So it definitely is an analysis part at the beginning to look at your dependencies to understand what is possible for you to migrate to support both frameworks initially. And maybe that's just a first step, is to migrate something to a little bit older. And then now that you're on .NET Core or whatever, then you can start to migrate upwards from there.
Oh, I think I found it. Sebastian Ross, output caching.
Yep.
And it's output caching in ASP.NET Core 6. Warning, this package is not supported.
Yep, exactly.
But he's definitely done us a favor, right? This is exactly what this is for. It's a bridge to get to 6 with that feature, and knowing as soon as possible, you're going to move to 7.
So output caching was one of those things, like it is kind of shared state, but not really. Like if the two applications have two caches with the same data, whatever. Like
that's good enough.
It's it's not shared. It is persistent, but it's not shared across pages. So really, session state. And then the next thing we hit was Hangfire. That was another big hurdle for us, was to get Hangfire being able to be used on both sides.
So what's Hangfire?
Yeah, what is that?
Oh, Hangfire is it's a background task runner for ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. And in terms of background tasks, it's not like thread.start or thread.run. It's persistent. So it's able to effectively have like a queuing capability or state capturing capability. So if I want to say, send this email, but don't send it now, send it, in a background, whatever, but something that can actually be retried and like remembered. So Hangfire is a library that lets you do that. It also does things like scheduled jobs too. So like it's cron, but it's all self-hosted inside of ASP.NET and ASP.NET Core. And if you haven't had the Hangfire folks on to talk to them, that's a fantastic library if you want to do like async background tasks in a more robust manner.
Nice. So noted.
So one of the challenging things is in Hangfire, you can define queues of work to say, go do this work sometime in the future. And then it supports all sorts of queuing mechanisms, including SQL. One of the cool things it does, though, is you can say, I'm in my controller class and I say, go do this work. But the work you're saying to do is to call this function that's also inside the controller class. So it's very easy to say, just extract out a method and say, just call this one method, but call it offline in the background. So it's just a more robust way of doing thread.run or whatever, but it's able to keep track of it. The way it does this, though, is it notes the class and type of the method that you want to run, and then also captures the state you pass into it in like some blob to be able to use reflection to load it up and then call it. But that implies that the thing that is going to sort of dequeue and start the work has to have access to that class and that type. And it's not something that's completely obvious unless you understand the internals of this hangfire system. Mm-hmm. So we realized that, okay, if I try to start the job on the ASP.NET 4 or 5 side, and I try to execute the job over on the .NET Core side, it may not have access to that job code. So we have to decide, do I refactor these jobs out into my common business logic so that both sides have access to it? We wind up not doing that. We wind up doing it to say, we will define queues. One queue for the .NET 4.8 side, one queue for the .NET Core side or .NET 6.7.8 side. And then when I need to in-queue a job, the on-queuer has to know, where does that code live? Does it live on the .NET 8 side, or does it live on the .NET 4 or 5 side? And what that let us do is just say, for the .NET 4 or 5 side, we will queue. It can start and run jobs on its side. Same side on the .NET 8 side, it can start and run jobs, and vice versa. So I can have .NET 4.8 kick off jobs on .NET Core, and .NET Core kick off jobs on 4.8, depending where that job logic actually lived. And so over time, we were able to migrate those jobs over to .NET 8, but along the way, not sort of force ourselves to have to refactor all that job logic, because it was pretty complicated. And we said, it's going to be too much work to try to pull all this stuff out into some common location, when today there were just private methods on a controller class. It'd be a lot of work to try to pull those out to somewhere else, when we realized like there's a lot of work that went into getting those things hooked up appropriately. But just another one of those things that I have shared kind of background resources between these two systems, and I have to figure out, how do I effectively get these two systems to kind of play nice with each other over time.
Yeah, and this is all part of that bridge. But you did get to the full cut across, like you said. You get to a point where you've replaced everything. Like how many deploys is that? How many interim steps?
Well, so the organizer I was working with was doing weekly deploys, and so we wanted to keep to that. Like every week, we would deploy the pages that we have migrated all the way out to production. We just didn't want to have this big bang. Okay, now all the pages are over. Now it's time to cut over. There was no cut over. It was just a slowly like constricting it down and down and down until the very end. I guess I didn't talk about migrating individual pages, but that was pretty straightforward. You basically copy and paste the code and fix the compile errors. If the dependencies weren't working, well, you go pull in those dependencies. And then if those dependencies had to be hooked up via dependency injection, well, now we go ahead and configure the new DI container to wire up all those dependencies. So it's very much an incremental, just pull things over as we went. And then if we saw extra problems that cropped up, we would pull those in. But otherwise, it really was just like fixing namespace errors and copying and pasting UI code. But we would deploy every week the new controllers and pages that had been pulled over. And even our stories inside of Jira, where every story was migrate this controller. Right. So we knew we had a clear sort of burn down, which is one controller at a time, just kind of steadily chopping away at it until eventually there were no more controllers left. And the only thing we had was an empty application that was still deployed all the way to production.
Right. But nothing in it.
Yep.
Well, yeah, except for the login controller, like the authentication. That was the last one.
Except the login controller, of course. Yeah. And that's fair. I wonder if you sort of nailed down all the hard bits early, like took spikes on stuff like output caching and so forth, or did you find a few as you work through some of these controllers? You're like, oh, how are we going to do this?
we tried to get a decent idea up front of cataloging, and it's pretty easy to do. Like you go to the global ASAX, right? Look at your middleware what is being pulled in there. This application was using Owen, so we looked at Owen startup, and of course web config, right? Because there's so much junk in there. We just looked at, okay, all of these things have features that exist in ASP.NET Core, more or less. So what is the sort of migration path? Well, we knew we were going to get it all. So one example is Hangfire. We hit that and we're like, oh, right. We get an error running the job. It's because it can't run the job. The job is over there, not over here. Right. And so we'd have to do, okay, let's pause, do a spike. And then we wind up doing things like, well, let's defer. Once we found that was an issue, just prioritization, we deferred all of the controllers that did that to say, let's just do them later because we need to figure this out first and work on some other ones that don't have that sort of dependency going on there.
That's legit, and it just feels normal. Like what I really appreciate about this whole conversation, Jimmy, is that you didn't go for the ideal case on anything. Like it's like, well, that will be good enough for now. We'll be able to optimize that later. That'll solve that one. This is an interim step, and and you're going to have some glitches along the way. It doesn't sound like it was a perfect migration. You had to fight through some stuff.
No, so we just made sure that in our schedule, we didn't try to solve all the world's problems up front. Like the big spike we did up front was just this whole YARP system web adapters, because that had just come out like a month before we started the project. I was like, oh, this is how we can do it. That's great. I was way more easier, but we had to figure out, okay, is it as easy as we think it is? And for the most part it was, except for like the shared state, the hard problems, authentication, whatever. But for like just normal pages, like it was even things like SignalR, it worked between those two applications. I was like, wow, that just as long as they can talk the protocol, that's how SignalR is supposed to work. It was able to proxy through just fine to the .NET Framework application.
Right before Christmas, I upgraded a customer's website, a Blazor site that I had built in .NET 6 and upgraded it to .NET 8. And that exactly the same. I mean, most of the stuff just worked. There's the obvious things, with Blazor, there's some big changes and stuff, and things that come out of program CS that were there before, things that go in, updating all the NuGet packages. But
yeah, that's
I mean, that was the very first thing, and then reformatting. But, as I said, I discovered some technical debt in there. This was definitely a project that I started the customer down the road, and then they kind of took it from there. And I wasn't like a babysitter on the project.
Right.
And I'm discovering all sorts of weird things.
They just found ways to make stuff work that come with consequences.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just, it works. It's great. It works, but it's not great. Great.
We definitely hit a bunch of things. It was just, it had been a while since I've been deeply involved in .NET 4.8 and ASP.NET 4.8. I just forgot how many things were fixed in ASP.NET Core. So there was so much code I got to just delete that was just, infrastructure wiring up stuff that is now just services.blah. It's just there and exists for me. So there's, a bunch of filters, Owen stuff that just went away and made me so happy. Oh, the web config. That was all code now. It was beautiful.
It's great.
Yeah, I know. So it's profound, but I appreciate that the core idea here was no dead drop. Start with YARP so that you have a blank new app that's just redirecting everything to the old app. And then my instinct would say, now pick the least important thing and build it first in the new app and see if that works. Like on a min screen. Yeah.
So that's what we wind up doing. It was I forget what it was, but it was something like the homepage or something that had like nothing on it. And we knew like that first one though took a lot, because that meant we had to have styling, we had to have layouts, we had to have all the dependencies hooked up. So yeah, we picked the dumbest page possible to start with, knowing that, okay, now we got to get like all the very application company specific gum, to glue it all together. That has to come along with that. So we're like, we'll just pick something dumb to make it simple for that first step.
Because then you're focused on those gubbins, right? Like that, the styling stuff, like all of that bits and pieces, because the page is not the most important. It's all of that. And again, you could get lost in that complexity.
All that ruckus.
Yeah, exactly.
Gubbins is a good word. I
love that. Thank you, John Skeet, for introducing me to that word.
Web gubbins.
My kids now say ruckus. There's all that ruckus in there.
That's great.
It's a good word. Oh boy, it totally makes sense. Like all of these bits and pieces, like that's the approach to go through the different parts, and you get to a good place eventually. So at a year, you figure did it take a year?
Oh no. Like it was a year of my life just dealing with several of their apps. So the one we migrated was done in about 4 months, and that was 100, 200 controllers and maybe about 500 actions or so.
Nice.
But like once our team got the hang of doing these pages, they could just like knock them out. It started to just become like a rhythm that they say the
That's cool.
we had the live, the living wiki page that would keep, okay, if you run into XYZ, here's how you solve that problem. And then just continually have our little micro lessons learned as we go. And it just started to really roll once we got going.
Yeah, I bet they got some momentum up. Like the cadence gets faster and faster as you know where all the bits lie. Where, that's how you solve this problem. That's how you solve that problem. Till you get
and eventually there's not new problems to solve anymore. It's just, okay, we figured out all the hard problems. Now it's just copy, paste, go.
Time. Yeah. Are they now better equipped to migrate something else inside the organization? Like I got to think this is somewhat personal mapping to the way that company likes to build apps, so that the skill set they now have is good for their apps, not necessarily good for everybody else's apps.
Yeah. So the next app was a lot easier because we knew we didn't have to prototype a lot of stuff. Like we didn't have to prototype the YARP stuff or understand, well, how do we solve the hang fire session problem? Like we knew how to do that. So it became a lot easier. If they had a giant web form system though, then like that's totally different. So if you're like vanilla MVC, vanilla web API, it's a pretty straightforward activity to do. There's always going to be things like, oh gosh, they were using some controller or some upload control that was not supported anymore. It last was released like in 2013.
Ouch.
Like, okay, for this thing, we need to migrate that thing first. There's always going to be those one-offs, but as a general approach, we knew this was the way to go. Incremental, small steps, and release as we go.
So Jimmy, what's next for you? What's in your inbox?
Oh, in my inbox? Oh gosh. Well, it's same old, same old, more modernization, more migrations, more upgrades to folks for doing this kind of thing. So I feel like I kind of learned it once. And so want to help more folks be able to do this in the future.
Very good. Speaking Anywhere coming up?
I am. I'll be at NDC London next month.
With all the cool kids. Yeah.
Yeah, I guess so. And then I'm taking a break. Maybe I'll be at the MVP Summit. Still deciding in March. Take a little break and then do some travel next in April, I guess.
Awesome.
Oh, very good. Well, it's been great talking to you as always.
And
Happy New Year, and we'll see you next time, dear listener, on .NET Rocks.
.NET Rocks is brought to you by Franklin's Net and produced by Plop Studios, a full-service audio, video, and post-production facility located physically in New London, Connecticut, and of course in the cloud. Online at pwop.com. Visit our website at dotnetrocks.com for RSS feeds, downloads, mobile apps, comments, and access to the full archives going back to show number 1, recorded in September 2002. And make sure you check out our sponsors. They keep us in business. Now go write some code. See you next time.
Got a transmitter banned by the FC.